So I wanted to ask you guys two things. First, will everyone take a deep breath with me? Cool. Second, when I say leader, you say change. Leaders, change. Leaders, change. Leaders, change. Listen, because you're destined for greatness. What a bold statement. For many don't have a voice and rather sit in silence and rather don't have a choice. I rise whether it's hardship. Leadership inside my DNA. That's facts. You stand where you lead and you lead where you stand. Great hopes and dreams. From broke to bigger dreams, I'll run for you and me, then mix this poetry. That's real. But not as real as the issues of the city, from the opiate crisis to gentrification and homelessness and race. Is the reason I race before my mental state breaks, to share my vision with all good lenses. It's as clear as a sunny day on Broadway. Let's take a trip down memory lane. I'm still invisible, only accepting the change, because my light and energy could spark the city for many moons. This is for the leaders in the room with shared vision of inclusivity, dreams, and longevity. What's in your DNA? Change will start today, but together let's find a way to merge and collaborate, because together we move at a faster rate to impact the city. So I'm asking you one more time. What's in your DNA, your team, your worth, your word, your work, you heard, you know, you learn? Ooh, you're destined for greatness. What a bold statement. For many don't have a voice and many don't have a choice. I fly to speak on stages, when all reality, community is what we need to reach our greatness. Great hopes and dreams. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, that was amazing, because it was as if he wrote that specifically for this session. So I don't know, did you? That's a perfect setup. Another round of applause. So one of the things that I have enjoyed, and I think JFF has enjoyed in our partnership with Aspen around this work over the last several years, has been this amazing ongoing commitment to organizing and building power among those people who are most impacted by the work that by the broken economic system, and that we are trying to work with in our collaboratives. And I think that the focus on organizing and the focus on equity has really deeply enriched the collective impact approach. I mean, it seems to me that it's actually really kind of changed the field of collective impact, and is a sort of living demonstration of how do you do this? How do you bring equity into collective impact work? What I especially appreciate about what Aspen has done is that they never take a kind of one and done attitude towards these things. They keep circling back and bringing in new ways to think about organizing, think about sort of human transformation, think about how do we sort of break the shackles of poverty, if you will. So we've heard from, and Steve was sort of referencing this when he opened the session, that we've had this thread. We had Angela Glover Blackwell, longstanding leader in the equity movement. We had Marshall Gans last May, who is just straight up from the Alinsky style organizing world. And then yesterday we had John Powell, who I found his message to be sort of deceptively, it sort of seemed simple, and then when he sort of got into what he really meant, it was like you have to change your entire worldview to do the work that he's talking about. So we're going to continue that here with a really kind of an amazing lineup, it's going to we're going to be sharing a range of approaches around power building, around disrupting poverty, and around organizing. So you're going to hear from these amazing people. And as you listen, folks who work in communities, I'd like you to just be thinking about how do you take lessons from these range of strategies, these different sort of entry points, and bring them into your own work in building your collaboratives and building your pathways and building youth leadership. So let me tell you how this is going to go. First, we are going to hear a keynote address by David Rolf. He's an extraordinary leader. I will say very honestly, when I first heard about the Fight for 15 in Seattle several years ago, I had my doubts. I didn't really I didn't really see how this was going to happen. And lo and behold, not only did it happen in Seattle, but it set the stage for a wave of this work around the country. So we're going to first hear from David, and then we're going to have what's been billed as a series of TED Talks. But all our quote-unquote TED Talkers are saying they're not really TED Talks, so don't even. They're going to be sort of 5-minute brief talks about their own approaches to disrupting poverty and organizing. We're going to hear, and the bios are in your packets, so I'm not going to say them here, but Nisha Patel, Eric Braxton, and our very own Lashon, who has been with us long enough so that we get to refer to him as his first name, and we all know who he is. It's kind of like Dorothy or Steve. So then we're going to have a brief dialogue among these amazing people, and then true to our commitment to youth voice and leadership, we're going to have some audience, interaction and conversation, but we're going to start with some young leaders and hearing their perspective on what they heard. So, without any further ado, I'm going to invite David up to the stage.
Good afternoon. I want to just start by thanking the Aspen Institute and the Aspen Forum on Opportunity Youth for inviting me to speak and for including me in this event. For those of you who spend time, like I often do, with Aspen, it's not uncommon to hear words like opportunity, and it's not uncommon to hear words like mobility. Those aren't controversial words. Many people on both sides of the political aisle would say they're for opportunity and they're for mobility. But I really appreciated and loved walking into the building today and not just seeing words on signs and in the program about opportunity and mobility, but seeing signs about justice and about power. The black gay union leader who organized the 1963 March on Washington, where Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, was a man named A. Philip Randolph. He famously said, "At the banquet table of nature, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take, and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, then you don't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, then you don't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization." Now, when we think about power, I sort of think that power is the currency of change. If there is a change you wish to seek, that change can only happen if you and others together have the power to make it so. Now, power can come from the barrel of a gun. Power can come from the command of armies. It can come from the control of millions or billions of dollars. But probably no one in this room has any of those things. For us ordinary people, power comes from acting together with strength and unity, often in the face of significant opposition, to achieve a common goal or objective. This nation was not exactly born into perfection. At the dawn of the Republic, we had slavery, we had smallpox, we had short life expectancy, and we had suffrage restricted to property-owning white men. But at the same time, we had this crazy dream, a dream of liberty and justice for all. And for 200 years, always through struggle, we passed along a little more liberty and a little more justice to each passing generation. But it was always through struggle. The abolition struggle, the women's suffrage struggle, the anti-sweatshop struggle, the early labor movement, the civil rights struggle, and so forth, down to this day, where in this city, workers a few years ago passed the first 2 laws establishing $15 minimum wages, and where just last week, our city council voted to tax one of the richest and largest companies on the planet in order to try to address homelessness. Well, the struggle continues. But I'm somewhat, I'm an optimist by nature because I couldn't be an organizer if I weren't an optimist. And my lived experience, especially as someone who spent 2 decades or more organizing minimum wage home care workers to form unions raise their wages, win health care, win retirement plans, and win dignity and justice on the job. I believe I have seen it with my own eyes again and again and again, that when people organize together, act with strength and solidarity, they can, and sometimes with the threat of disruptive force, they are capable of achieving incredible change. But if you look around our country right now, there are reasons not to be optimistic. Imagine, I'm looking at the average age in the room and realize that if I refer to things that happened 40 years ago, you might have read about those in a history book in many cases. But imagine getting into a time machine and finding yourself in the 1970s, and someone running for office said, you know what, a bunch of great things are going to happen. We're going to see the end of the Cold War, no more foreign military threats to U.S. soil. Women are going to double their workforce participation. We're going to get rid of the last of the Jim Crow laws. We're going to create more wealth in the next 30 years than has been created in all of human history. Cure diseases that haven't been cured. Create technologies that haven't been created. It would have been a pretty astounding and futuristic set of predictions. But if that same person had then gone on to promise that 93% of that wealth would go to the top 1% of income earners, that 7% of it would go to the top 10% of income earners, 0% to the bottom 50% of income earners, or the bottom 90% of income earners, and the bottom 50% would have to take a pay cut. What if someone had predicted that the low point in black poverty in America would have occurred in 1975? What if someone had predicted that the high point of equality in America would have occurred, economic equality would have occurred in 1970? What if someone told you that the net impact of women doubling their workforce participation between 1977 and 2012 was $0 in take-home pay for the bottom 90% of income-earning households? It probably would have made you mad. And it probably would have made you doubt that futuristic, gauzy, high-tech future you were being promised was going to benefit the majority or the supermajority of our fellow Americans. America has now become a low-wage nation. When I was born, we had the world's largest middle class. Today, we're number 27. The average, half of all American workers make $17 an hour or less, 43% 15 or less, 25% $10 or less. We have, over the course of a generation, made debt-free college a thing of the past, shredded the funding for urban and rural public schools, got rid of unions, got rid of pensions, imported third world wages, exported manufacturing. And we wonder why our politics are fractious and divided. And we wonder why so many people sit on the sidelines of both the workforce and the electorate. But the good news, from my perspective, is, as we used to say during the Occupy movement, it was not always this way, and it doesn't have to be this way. It's a refrain I keep coming back to again and again in my book, right? Because it was not God that made automobile workers a good job in 1950. It was humans who did that. Humans who went on strike, who had the power to force the world's largest company at the time to say yes when they wanted to say no. Humans, by organizing together, holding the powerful accountable. Workers today have begun to fight back. Yesterday, 6,000 graduate student employees of the University of Washington walked out on strike for better wages and health care. Today in North Carolina, schools are closed because of a statewide teachers' strike, as has occurred now in Arizona and Oklahoma, and began in West Virginia. And I want to talk a little bit about the Fight for 15. I was in a room with people I guess it would be fair to describe as exceedingly high-level White House and Democratic Party leaders in the fall of 2012. And my colleague from Chicago asked one of these people, whom he knew from back in the day, what do you think about raising the minimum wage to, I don't know, what do you think, $8.50, $9, $10? And it was almost a laughing answer that we got. Oh, no, raise the wages, that's going to kill jobs and hurt the recovery and hurt small businesses. Not, by the way, not because that's ever been true, but because that's what we are told is true by people who have an economic interest in keeping wages low. But less than a month later, the first group of fast food workers in Brooklyn walked off the job calling for a $15 wage. The fight for 15 and a union had begun. A few hundred people in one relatively small part of a big city made a seemingly implausible demand. Meanwhile, here in Seattle, we had knocked on 100,000 doors in South Seattle and South King County during the Great Recession and talked to not people who were registered to vote, not people who necessarily were employed. We just went door to door and talked to people about jobs and the economy. And one of the data points that rose up was the number, thousands of people working full-time but living in poverty at our airport. And if you haven't checked lately, you can't really export an airport overseas to take advantage of low-wage work. But over the course of a generation, what used to be good family wage jobs with health care and pensions had become minimum wage unbenefited jobs. And so we had this movement of fast food workers starting on the East Coast, this movement of airport workers starting on the West Coast. And by 2013, we were in the midst of a big fight over whether work should pay. And our little city of SeaTac, which is, Seattle's a big metropolitan area. SeaTac is the municipality that contains the airport, became the very first place in the country to pass a $15 wage law in November of 2013. Workers who had grown frustrated by 3 or 4 years of unsuccessful attempts to get our major airlines and the Port of Seattle that operates the airport to recognize their unions, instead decided to take the fight to the ballot and qualified a ballot measure in the city of SeaTac that asked, should wages be $15 an hour? And there were a number of other provisions about paid sick leave, full-time work guarantees, and the like. And we had a very public debate where every voter probably had their door knocked on 25 times by the pro-minimum wage folks and the anti-folks. And some of what the anti-folks said was kind of funny. They said all the hotels were going to close down, all the restaurants were going to close down. The one luxury hotel in SeaTac was probably going to downsize and lay off workers. The general manager of that hotel even had the nerve to say that if the wage went up to 15, he wouldn't be able to afford to give his staff free meals during their breaks, and that some days that was the only meal they got. Think about that one. So you pay people so little they can't afford to buy their own food, and no. But on election day, by a margin of 77 votes, which is why you should never let anyone tell you your vote doesn't count, by a margin of 77 votes, the voters of SeaTac, which is a largely immigrant, people of color city, governed largely by conservative older white homeowners who bothered to show up in August off-year municipal elections, enacted the country's first $15 wage law. And a funny thing happened. That hotel that said it was going to downsize, it actually broke ground on a new wing with 2 presidential suites and a luxury spa, because it turns out that since the investors might be making less per room night due to the higher wages, they just needed to expand the capacity of the hotel so they could make as much money as they'd planned. The hotel industry that was going to go out of business, they've now permitted 4 new hotels for construction in that little city. And then meanwhile, after we won in SeaTac, in the November rain, conducted a 15-mile march to bring $15 north from SeaTac into the city of Seattle, where we had a much different conversation on our hands. Because workers in Seattle in the fast food sector had been going on strike routinely for 6 months. Strikes, boycotts, days of action, sit-ins, civil disobedience against wage theft. And those fast food workers in Seattle transformed the narrative of Seattle's 2013 election, so that whatever you thought about, you were going to talk about when you announced your candidacy for mayor, there was one dominant issue occupying the narrative of the city that you could not escape from. In every community forum, in every meeting, you were going to be asked, where do you stand on the $15 minimum wage? And by the time we got to that SeaTac victory in November of 2013, Seattle was busy electing a mayor and a city council, all of whom in some form or format had pledged that over some timeline they would support the establishment of the nation's first $15 minimum wage in a big American city. And because, yeah, thanks, please. And because the business community saw what happened in CTAC, they said, you know what? We don't want to fight, we want to negotiate. And so for 4 months, myself and other representatives of worker and community organizations literally sat across the table from the leaders of Seattle's business community to peacefully negotiate the implementation of the first big city $15 minimum wage. Now, we heard all of the normal myths. Restaurants were closed. Tom Perez, who was then the Secretary of Labor, said, David, every time I come to your city, I pack my lunch because I think all the restaurants have closed there. I keep reading that. Now, restaurants do sometimes close. It's a volatile industry, but on average, since then, we've opened about 3 new restaurants for everyone that's closed. The Jimmy John's restaurant 3 blocks from my office has a big sign saying now hiring $20 an hour. So all of the trickle-down mythology that when wages go up, jobs will go down was disproven. Because the truth is, it was never right to begin with. When wages go up, jobs go up, because when workers have money, they actually spend it. So if you give a low-wage worker a pay increase, what do? They fix the dryer, they enroll in a class, they buy a textbook, they fill a prescription, they give to their congregation, they go to the store, they buy groceries, maybe they go out to eat once a week. All of that money circulating in the local community, in turn creating demand and causing hiring and jobs. It's an upward spiral in the economy. This is why when everyone tells you high wages produce unemployment, ask them to look at Seattle with less than 3% unemployment today, or Germany with less than 3% unemployment, highest wages in the world. It turns out that's not how the economy works. It's not that when wages go up, jobs go down. It's that the better we all do, the better we all do. And the secret sauce is that inclusion is the critical element of growth. Because the more people included in an economy are then participating every day in that economy and allows the economy to grow. By contrast, so if you give $1 of pay increase to a low-wage worker, it comes back at a 2.4% multiplier effect into the local community. If you give a billionaire a tax break to create a job, it comes back at 80 cents worth of value. So you lost 20 cents. Because a lot of that money went into the stock market, went to overseas tax havens and private bank accounts. It did not recirculate in the local community. So what we believe we have done with things like the Fight for 15 and many other efforts, including up to what's going on in North Carolina today, is to actually disprove the theory that the economy is like the weather and you can't do anything about it, but to prove the theory that the economy is created by humans, and humans united together with acts of strength and solidarity and sometimes defiance can actually change the outcome of history for some of the most disempowered and invisible people that are amongst our communities and our sisters and brothers. But I want to name a bigger problem. And I want to name it not because I know exactly how to solve it, but because I suspect that in this room, the ingenuity and experience and energy probably exists to solve it in our lifetimes. And I'm going to name that problem as the $2 trillion problem. $2 trillion is the amount of our national income that has been redistributed upwards to the 1% every year since the 1970s. It didn't happen because we became a poorer nation. We're richer than ever. It didn't happen because we became less educated. We're more educated than ever. It didn't happen because capital markets were volatile. It didn't happen because CEO pay was shrinking. It didn't happen because productivity was going down. All of those things were going up. It happened because we followed the wrong leaders and the wrong ideas and adopted the wrong policies that on balance had the impact of redistributing both wealth and income upward to the tune of $2 trillion a year, or about 12% of our GDP. Now, those are gigantic numbers, but if you think about a typical American family, an American family that today earns, let's say, $55,000 a year, would be earning over $83,000 a year if they had benefited from the economic growth and productivity growth of our economy every year since the 1970s. In fact, we were on a trajectory to eliminate poverty by the end of the century in the 1970s, and instead we threw the whole thing into reverse. But again, this wasn't something God did to us to punish us for our sins. At least I don't think so. I think this was a choice, this was a result of human choices and human actions. And so I want to encourage all and maybe even inspire all of you and all of us to think about is, how do we take the $2 trillion back? How do we make sure that anyone who works for a living has a self-sufficiency wage that they can support a family on? How do we get rid of debt to fund college and make college a right for anyone who can get admitted to their higher education institution of their choice? How do we stop our families from going bankrupt due to medical debt? How do we, 40 years after women flooded into the workforce in the 1970s, we still never had a national conversation about care and the care economy, both for child care and elder care, right? Creating gigantic inequities and costs on working families. And what I want to suggest, that all of those inequities and all of that redistribution upward didn't happen by accident. It was a result of choices, and we can make different ones. That in our organizing for power, for potentially disruptive power, we need to have the courage not to do small things. We have to have the courage to do big things. When we were laughed at by White House officials about an $8 or $9 minimum wage, our purpose was not to go back and recalibrate our expectations downward to $7.75. It was to actually say no. The arguments are going to be the same. The opponents are going to be the same. We're going to have just as many people fighting against us. So why spend your life doing something small when you can do something big? We have generational challenges. We have generational challenges with equity, with growth, with the economy, with education, with the environment. Pick your poison. There is no small amount of generational challenges, of moonshot challenges that we have to address. But what I never heard, when I studied history, I never heard someone say, we could not win the war against fascism and the Axis in World War II. I heard our leaders say we can do it, and every American has a role to play. And I never heard someone say we can't cure polio. I never heard John F. Kennedy say we cannot go to the moon. So why are we saying we can't have a middle class? Why are we saying that the American dream has to be a thing of the past? Why are we allowing politicians to tell us it's not realistic to raise wages, to restore equity to our economy, and to give every American who works hard and plays by the rules a true opportunity at achieving the American dream for themselves and their children? The reality is, it is just as realistic and just as pragmatic and practical as it ever was, as practical as abolition, as suffrage, as the end of child labor, as the early labor movement, as the civil rights movement. It is just as practical to say, we want the $2 trillion back. We are going to unite and speak with simple, true words of strength and solidarity until we get it done. Thank you for listening to my thoughts.
Thank you, David. So one of the things I love about hearing speakers at Aspen is that they give us the language that we can use back in our work. And I heard two things that I want to take with this. One is, how do we take the $2 trillion back? I mean, what a rallying cry. And inclusion is good for the economy, which really resonates with what we heard from John Powell yesterday. So thank you, that was terrific. So we're now going to have our TED Talkers panelists come up. I'd like to invite Nisha, Eric, and Lashon up to the stage. So I know that Monique did a really good job of organizing this whole thing and figuring out how she's going to make it work. And I know you must have, in your planning conversations, had a conversation about how in 5 minutes you're going to talk about the challenge you're addressing, talk about the strategies you're employing, and talk about the role of young people in your approach, and talk about the lessons learned. But that's what they've told me you all are prepared to do.
Lies, all lies.
So I think we're going to start with you, Nisha.
Okay, in there. All right, good afternoon, and there should be some slides coming up. So, all right. Yes, so I am going to try, and I was told I had 7 minutes or less. So I'm going to try to summarize 2 years worth of work in 7 minutes or less. So hopefully this works. So the question that the project I've been directing for the past 2 years really was set up to get at some of the problems that David actually just identified, which is really we had one question in 2 years to answer it. What would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? Or another way to put that is, what would it take to restore the American dream? And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on a report that I recently co-authored that's called Restoring the American Dream. You can go to mobilitypartnership.org for more information on that. But so our job was really to be in the idea generation business, right? And with a particular emphasis on philanthropy and public sector as potential investors in the ideas, but also always keeping in mind that it's practitioners, it's direct service providers, it's advocates, it's organizers, and it's researchers who are really the ones who are going to play a role in testing and implementing and moving the ideas forward. So a bit about the group. You will see some names. I think the color looks weird from where I am, but hopefully you can read that. Some of the people involved. So the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, it's chaired by David Elwood at the Harvard Kennedy School. I serve as the executive director, but then we have 24 members whose names you see on the screen who come from incredibly diverse perspectives and political points of view. And one thing that was really important about our group is that we're not a consensus group. Which I actually think made for bolder ideas. So not every person agrees with every individual idea that we've put forward. And the other thing I want to say is a couple of things that make this group really different than some that have come before. The majority of our group are people of color, which I think is too rare in any commissions that I see, and particularly in national ones. And they come from a mix, from research, from practice, from people who are implementing programs on the ground. And that was an important part of our DNA. As we went about our work, we certainly looked at research and at evidence, but we spent just as much time in communities, in 30 communities around the country all told, talking to people, implementing programs, but talking to people, including young people who are experiencing poverty, and bringing that perspective into our work and into our solutions. And so we were in 30 plus communities, including the Pacific Northwest, in Seattle, in Tacoma. We were up at Lummi Nation. And so where have we landed? This is, okay. I want to share two big insights. And the first is we had to talk about what do we mean by mobility from poverty? How are we going to define success? And, we really pushed ourselves to think much more creatively in this group than I think commissions like this often do. We're certainly not the first group to tackle poverty in the United States. But what we realized pretty quickly is, income, super important, right? Wealth, super important. But if we only focused on that and said, well, here's the federal poverty line, or pick another line, and if we help individuals and families, if you're a family of 4 and the federal poverty line is $24,600, if you now make $24,601, are you really that much better off? Are you not poor anymore? Are you on a pathway to mobility? And if you stop and think about it, the answer is most likely no. You're going to continue to struggle. And so at our very first gathering, as we talked about defining success, one of our partnership members, John Powell, who you all heard from earlier, right, said this profound thing that just resonated with the entire group. He said, here's the thing about poverty. It's not just about a lack of money. It's also about a lack of power. So exactly where David started, right? We have to talk about power. So economic success, super important, it's foundational, but it's not enough. Second, and equally important, this notion of power and autonomy, of having agency over your own life. And I know that's a lot about the work that all of you do in the room, about building agency individually and in communities. But then third and equally important is this notion of being valued in community. And what was fascinating about this, I mentioned we have people in our group who come from very different political points of view. And so John Powell talks about this concept, and he may have talked about it here with you, as belonging, right? Belonging versus othering. Arthur Brooks, another partnership member who heads up the American Enterprise Institute, comes from a much more conservative point of view. And he talks about this concept as dignity, right? As having meaning in your life. And what we pretty quickly realized was these concepts are part and parcel of the same thing. So we talk about it as being valued in community. Another way to talk about it is social capital or social connection or social inclusion. And we think it's all three of these principles that have to be embodied when we talk about upward mobility. And for each of the ideas that we've put forward, they have to embody these principles, and we have to start to measure outcomes across all of them. So not only do we need to measure income and wealth, we've got to measure whether power and autonomy are increasing, whether a sense of belonging is increasing. And then the next sort of big insight I'll talk about very quickly, because I only have a couple of minutes left, is 5 big strategies. So it won't be a surprise to anyone in this room. We didn't just come up with one idea that's going to solve this problem. It's actually going to take investment in multiple strategies. And the first relates to something that David talked about, which is narrative. That was a big part of the Fight for 15. We believe we've got to change the narrative around how we talk about poverty and how we talk about people in poverty in the United States. There is so much stigma that goes along with it, and so much blame and a lack of focus on the structural issues that have gotten us to where we are. So it's probably the toughest to do, but if we can move the needle, if we can move the narrative, we think it'll open up opportunities to move the rest of these strategies forward. And so the other strategies, the second one is exactly what David talked about, which is creating access to good jobs. And so he's talked a lot about that. I have limited time, so that's all I'll say about that. The third one is around this idea of ensuring that zip code isn't destiny. So what we know is right now, where we are born and where we grow up, which we have no control over, plays a huge role in our later outcomes, and that shouldn't be the case. And that's also not by accident, right? We have a history of public policies that have reinforced economic and racial segregation and disinvestment in neighborhoods. And so that's not going to change overnight, and it's going to take intentional strategies. And then fourth, this idea of providing support that empowers, right? So we have large numbers of publicly and privately funded programs that are set up with the goal of helping people move out of poverty, but they often don't provide services that offer dignity, that offer respect, that foster people's engagement in community. And so the aspiration is we need to have programs and policies put people and families at the center and support their goals and capacity working across different domains. And then finally, if narrative is overarching, it's like the context for everything, right? It's the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. Undergirding all of this is the idea of transformative use of data. So all of us collect mass amounts of data, but rarely are those data matched and made available in ways that are usable and accessible, particularly to people in poverty themselves. And so we want to increase accountability and transparency of data. And so I'll end by saying, in summary, again, there's no one strategy. It's going to take investment and implementation of these 5 mutually reinforcing strategies, and it's going to take cross-sector collaboration. So there's no one government agency, there's no one philanthropy, no one youth-serving organization that's going to do it alone, but working together. What came out of our partnership is that we believe we can dramatically increase mobility from poverty and begin to restore the American dream. So I will stop there.
Wow. Thank you. There's so much of what you said, Nisha, that completely resonates with the work that the communities are doing here around changing narrative, around a different way of using data. And I think that the programs that people are putting into place are providing support that empowers. That is core to the work of the community organizations and others here. So that's amazing how much resonates. Thank you. Okay, Eric, come on down.
All right, well, thank you all for inviting me to be part of this conversation, and I really appreciate that we started this conversation by talking about the role of organizing ordinary people to build power. I want to talk specifically about the role of young people in building power. In the last few months, since the tragic shooting in Parkland, there's actually been a lot of attention towards young people organizing. And a lot of people were surprised at the power and eloquence of those youth voices. What I want to hold out is that actually throughout our history, young people have always been on the forefront of social justice, whether it was the women's movement, that's right, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. Young people have an inherent sense of justice and a willingness to take risks that has meant that they've always led some of the most important changes. And that's true throughout history. And it's been true over the last 20 years, where a pretty dynamic youth organizing field has developed across the United States. So at our work at the Funders Collaborative on Youth Organizing, we've developed an interactive map and database of youth organizing groups that you can log on to on our website if you're interested. And there are about 200 groups that have active profiles now across the country. So these groups mostly organize low-income young people of color, mainly focused on middle school and high school age, but some older than that as well. And over the last few years, these groups have dramatically increased their ability to win policy changes that affect the lives of hundreds of thousands of young people. So for example, in 2005 in Los Angeles, a coalition of groups got the school district there to pass a policy that ensured college preparatory curriculum for all students in LA. Since then, in East LA, the graduation rate has gone up by over 35%. Similarly,
You can clap.
that's right, you can clap for that. That was young people in LA that created that created those changes. And similarly, students across the country started responding years ago to the trend towards harsher discipline policies, right? A few years ago, what we were hearing about was zero tolerance. We need more police in schools. But young people started organizing to end the school-to-prison pipeline, and they have fundamentally changed the common sense on school discipline to the point where restorative justice is being spread throughout schools across the country. So we know that when young people organize, they can lead these changes. What I want to focus on for a minute, and what I think is perhaps most exciting, is that not only does youth organizing result in improving communities, but it's also one of the best ways to support the holistic development of young people, especially for low-income young people and young people of color. So we recently released a report, and you can download this from our website at fcyo.org, that tracked some of the newest research on how engaging and organizing affects the development of individual young people. So the research identified several key features for why organizing has such positive outcomes on young people. They found that it has a learning process that includes cycles of preparation, rehearsal, and performance and feedback, that there are accelerated opportunities for leadership, that engaging and organizing is relevant to the everyday struggles and aspirations of young people, and that there were positive, affirming relationships that recognize young people's dignity and humanity. They also found that for organizations that scored higher in terms of their organizational culture, where young people felt more affirmed in that space, that those organizations also had higher ratings. Those higher ratings were predictive of higher outcomes, including positive racial and social identity, critical thinking, academic empowerment, hope, and commitment to future civic engagement. So we know that engaging and organizing has all of these positive outcomes for the individual young people. Another key finding was that youth organizing is highly effective at reaching the social and emotional learning outcomes that many researchers now believe are the best predictors of future success. That through their organizing work, young people learn to channel their emotions through constructive action, maintain their composure, and stay focused on their goals, even when they're faced with difficult emotions like anger, anxiety, frustration, and demoralization. In another study that followed 1,400 young people across California that were supported by the California Endowment, they were able to compare the outcomes for young people that were involved in youth organizing versus more traditional youth development and youth leadership approaches, and they found that the outcomes for young people in youth organizing were equivalent and sometimes higher. Now, for a long time, the research that we had was mostly pretty much short-term. We didn't have longitudinal studies. But in 2005, the Mott and Gates Foundations funded a study of over 410 youth organizing alumni in California, and they found that when compared to other young people from similar backgrounds, that young people engaged in organizing were far more likely to go to four-year universities, and they were also far more likely to stay civically engaged years after their involvement in youth organizing. So, for many years, we've had anecdotes about the impact of engaging and organizing on young people. I believe that we now have the research to demonstrate that youth organizing truly is one of the most effective strategies for supporting the holistic development of young people, especially low-income young people and young people of color. And based on this, I want to assert that there are three paradigm shifts that we need to make in how we think about young people and youth development work. First, for a long time, we've been stuck in this idea of young people as having deficits and problems that we need to solve. And in some cases, we move beyond that to say that young people actually have assets. Or maybe we go beyond that to say that they have a voice. I want to say that we need to make a further paradigm shift to say that young people actually have the power to transform their communities. Second, most of our frameworks on youth development and social emotional learning have not paid much attention to the role of agency and leadership and organizing in the development of those young people. We need to change our dominant paradigms and narratives on youth development to recognize that engaging in organizing, engaging in solving problems in communities is one of the best ways to support the development of young people. And finally, we often get caught in this thing about the difference between individual change and community transformation. And I know that as community leaders and funders, we often think we have to choose between those two things. But the truth is that individual change and community transformation are fundamentally linked. We cannot do one without the other. We can't expect our young people to be all so resilient that they can succeed in communities that are crumbling. The most effective way for us to make change is to link community and individual transformation, and that's what youth organizing does. So finally, I want to say that I'm really glad we're having this conversation about ending poverty. And I think in order to do that, we're going to need to be able to create some fundamental structural changes to our economy. If we're going to do that, we are going to need to organize and build power. Throughout history, young people have always been on the forefront of movements to do that. And if we're serious about taking on that kind of challenge, we need to support the leadership of young people to be at the forefront of such a movement. Thank you.
This is turning out to be such a call to action. It's like unbelievable. Lashon, how perfect for you to follow.
Perfect. Yeah, Sabia. Perfect. So I was asked by Monique to talk about our work and everything that we do and related to economic mobility, decreasing poverty, and also relating it to some of the work that my colleagues here on stage are doing. So I'm going to try my best as the countdown continues. So first off, we are a movement of opportunity youth and adult allies set out to do two things: increase opportunity and decrease poverty in America, especially for young people that we call opportunity youth. I think it's important to note that we are organizing and building unity across generations, geography, races, and a few other factors, but I mentioned that because when you talk about economic mobility, like she mentioned, where you live, your race, and even the economic situation of your parents influences that, in addition to environment. So the fact that we are represented across these different aspects gives us some leeway. So as far as our recommendations, we, at the time, the National Council of Young Leaders, who are all former opportunity youth, got together and created that roadmap for to create those pathways out of poverty, right? Because we've all been through it and we somewhat climbed out of it. So we compiled our struggles and we you know, compared our victories. And here's what we came up with. We have immediate pathways out of poverty to reconnect at least 1 million young people, which you'll see on the right side, right? And then on the systems change piece, we have recommendations for broader systems change so that, again, we can start eliminating the conditions of poverty for why these young people are pouring in front of these program doors every day seeking that opportunity. But I'm sure you know, like I know, with any policy, legislation, or plan, or anything like that, if you don't have a plan for implementation, nothing's going to happen, right? And we had this document, and we had this agenda, and we, the National Council of Young Leaders, are making a lot of wave in D.C., but we needed to have that impact happen all across the nation, starting in Boston, and now we over here in Seattle, Oakland, you know, we from coast to coast. So again, for just that thinking, right, that this movement has to go local, that this movement has to go grassroots, led us to the movement from being a council to opportunity youth, right? So OIU, the movement, has about 3 main components that I would quickly like to walk through. Like I said, we started off as National Council of Young Leaders who really set the agenda, set the vision, but we knew we had to go grassroots. So now we have 14 community action teams that we work with who are organizing their cross-sector partners and organizing their local young people to really drive that change in their community. Many of them in the room today: Seattle, Phoenix, San Francisco, the newest addition to the bunch. Of course, I hope I mentioned Seattle, Atlanta. You know, forgive me if I missed you, but we in the building. But in addition, due to resources, we can't have community action teams in every community, right? But we have strong young leaders and advocates advocates who we want to uplift. So we also have community leaders that we're building out who are coming from various communities doing this work. So with that said, I want to talk about our work through how we build power and economic mobility. And I read Nisha's report called Restoring the American Dream, and they have 5 strategies which she already laid out to you on how we can increase, increase mobility out of poverty. So I decided to talk about our work through their 5 strategies. I adopted some language a little bit first. So it starts with changing the narrative. Like she said, how we think about people shifts the way we shifts our perspective of people, and eventually the policies that we devise for these people, right? So we're talking about system change for opportunity youth. We need to change how these decision makers are thinking of our young people. So I'll give you a concrete way of how we're doing that. We've done a lot of social media campaigns to try to flip that narrative. I'd like to shout out Seattle, who just launched a campaign on Instagram called OI I'm Worth It. All of you check that out on Instagram. OYU Central has launched OYU Votes, where we had young people take pledges online saying that they will pledge to vote. So that's one simple way, again, to start changing that narrative in a positive way. Second, creating those pathways to powers. We recognize that power comes from the grass, from bottom up, but it also goes across. So it's about building power in the communities, but also putting our young people in positions of power across sectors and corporations and philanthropy and programs across and government across the board, right? And giving them that autonomy over their life, right? And civic engagement is another important piece of the power building, because regardless of the issues are, like Eric laid out, and are pretty similar to communities: criminal justice, immigrant rights, housing, all those different things. But we know that if they can build their political power, they can tackle all those issues, right? And that's part of the reason why young people are being ignored, because they're not showing up on these lists or these elected officials. So we're saying, civic engagement is broad, but here's a quick way to build that power. And it's about meeting young people where they're at. And this picture here is in Boston at a local bus station, Dudley Square, where you can see young people registering, young people as they're trying to get to their school or whatever, to register to vote. So I really love that picture. Transforming the data, I want to say, is very important. I think there's 2 important pieces to that. One is equipping our communities with the data that they need to have impact, whether it's voter turnout rates in the community, whether it's how many opportunity youth are in your particular city or county, or whether it's telling how much your city, state, and government is spending on this, and where the gaps are and where we need to start filling this. So again, equipping the communities, but also letting communities tell their own stories and provide their own data. So we just partnered with a university called Circle. We hired 12 opportunity youth to collect surveys from their peers. We collected 1,000 surveys from 6 different communities to talk about how young people feel about getting access to information that they need to vote themselves, but also their family members in the community. And once we get those findings, we're going to bring them to election administrators and advise them on how they could do better outreach in our communities. Increasing access to opportunity is the obvious. Our work is about bringing opportunities into our communities. Specifically, on a national level, we have the Reconnecting Youth campaign, where we've looked at how many opportunity youth are in this country. We looked at how much the federal government is spending. We know the gaps, and we're putting the pressure to close it. Locally, we have a similar campaigns. Like I said, we're training our communities to look at, forget the 6 million or 4.9 million, how many young people are disconnected in your city, right? And then parallel that to how much your local government is spending, and then hit them up, right? So we have a national campaign, we got a local campaign. Long story short, we're bringing in real opportunities into those communities. Last and not least, which I really love, she talked about the zip code, what I call it restoring and revitalizing neighborhoods. When you talk about economic mobility, especially for people from Black and brown communities, they have to leave their community in order to be successful, right? And that's not necessarily fair. So through our organizing, like I said, we're tackling these issues so that we can create the communities that we want, that are healthy, that are wealthy, that are thriving, so that we don't have to leave these communities to be successful. So I'll just quickly, maybe that was my cue. Okay, some other quick examples of some victories. We're new, but them victories are rolling in. We brag different, so bear with me. Boston, you'll see, they engaged in a week of call to action around the criminal justice bill, around expunging in Massachusetts. just recently, that bill got put on the governor's desk and it got approved. So shout out to Boston and all the organizations a part of that. It wasn't just us. It was a strong effort. Sacramento, on the second town hall, engaging with their mayor, their city officials, they have secured a new and established Department of Youth. Now they're working on getting a dedicated line item to feed some funding into that department, right? Again, directly connecting those young people. In Atlanta, in Seattle, and a few other cities, we have supported 100K, not just bringing young people into a space to get jobs, but really putting young people in powerful positions to advise CEOs and corporations on how they can best create an environment that's not only attracts opportunities to their companies, but supports them in their companies. And I guess I'll stop there, and thank you for the time. I went over, sorry, y'all.
How amazing to hear all these stories of these successes at this moment in time when sometimes it feels like things are not getting better, but things are getting better, so thank you. I want to we're going to have about 15 minutes, 10 minutes of conversation amongst us here, and then we're going to open it up to you all, so get your questions and comments ready. I want to start by just asking you all if there's anything that you heard from each other that particularly resonated with you, that you want to draw some connections between what you said and what someone else said. So anything that you sort of heard in this series of TED Talks, which is really 5 minutes of talking really fast and a lot of information.
I think it's interesting that, maybe not surprising, but interesting that all of us, I think all four of us use the word power, or autonomy, or agency, or some version of that. And I think it just, so that resonates back to me, sort of what we found over our 2 years worth of work, that typically when you think about poverty or opportunity or mobility or even justice, whichever word you want to use, often we as a field of people working in, whether you work on the ground, you're an organizer or a direct service organization or philanthropy, or you work in a government agency, we think about, to solve a problem, we need this metric that is, are people's incomes getting better? Do they have more wealth? And again, those are important, but can you achieve that without shifting the power balance? And also, is it really enough? Is that all it's really about? And I think pretty clearly the answer is no.
Yeah, I also was struck by all of us talking about the role of power in this, and encouraged to hear us talking about that, because it's clear to me that if we're going to take on a problem as large as poverty, we are going to need to build real and meaningful power to make that change. I think one of the questions for us is what kinds of action actually builds that kind of power? And we recently did a lot of listening to youth organizing groups around the country about that. And what some of them said to us was, it seems like some of the organizational models that we've built are really built around an advocacy approach, where we put out a lot of good reports and we tell people the right solution. And we have a small number of folks who are charismatic leaders, and we can win some small changes with that kind of a model. But the big changes, we're going to need to build a lot more power than that to be able to win, right? They would not have won $1 minimum wage by putting out a report about why it's good and having a few charismatic leaders say that this is what we need. No, they had to organize and build a lot of, so the big changes we need to think about what are the organizing models that allow us to build that kind of power to achieve those big changes.
Lashon, did you want to jump in on something here?
No, I think the only thing that resonated with me, especially in this space and also trying to collect resources for this type of work, of civic engagement and leadership, and how it's not valued, but how each of us have really laid out the importance of building power and the importance of empowering young people for the longer term success of the economic situation, right? Eric has some very concrete research, but she made it an essential component of her model. So despite the fact that we sort of internalize that and sort of on the same page, just really pushing that message out into the world, because I do feel like it's undervalued and just seen as this tactic, but it really transforms young people's lives, right? When they, and I liked how they said, in the report, the power of autonomy to take control of their lives and then have impact over others as well. And I think that's something that I took pride in with OIU, because we're not just about organizing. We also have support from 17 national sponsor organizations and many more locally, so that we are able to meet young people where they are, get them connected, and help them build on autonomy. And once they're about to cross that stage, it's like, all right, brother, how you giving back, brother or sister? You know what I mean? But sometimes, young people are forced into the space, and they're not ready, because like my young man said, I don't know who said it, they were talking about Maslow, like they have so many needs that haven't been met. And before you could talk about building their power or to get them to care about the community, the world, or even them, you have to really invest and pour into them. So that's just something that stood out to me.
I agree with everyone who said how resonant it was that we all talked about power. Let me pick up a couple of other strains in the conversation that I think are worth lifting up. One is about the role of leadership and agency and activism in development. Because we often think of paths out of poverty or into mobility as competency-based, skill-based, or credential-based propositions that can be solved with the right amount of technocratic application of the right level of funding or the right educational technique or whatever. Never mind the fact you're never going to win any of that stuff if you don't wield real power. It's also true that the act of, whether you're successful or unsuccessful at your first campaign, your first initiative, your first big effort, one of the thing that Fortune 500 CEOs have in common with each other, more likely than they're all being rich white men from Ivy League colleges, is that they had the chance to succeed or fail at something when they were in their 20s. And that the ability to actually lead and direct a project earlier in their career was a formative experience that changed the way they thought about agency and power throughout their entire lives. So that's one sort of takeaway I had from one of someone's slides. I'm not sure.
One of these fabulous speakers.
Yeah, which it was. And the other thing that I found interesting was the way that someone pointed out we confuse personal transformation with system transformation. And it's simply not true that getting if you have an aptitude and love for the STEM field and there's lots of career opportunities there and it's going to lift you out of poverty and change your family going forward, by all means do that, right? But that's different than solving the problem of why is our economy producing more bad jobs than good jobs, right? Because there are, at the end of the day, a limited number of those jobs that someone has already decided will be good. And we need to figure out how to build an economy that includes everyone. So I think this sort of confusion for personal achievement and catharsis with systemic change is another sort of top level take for me listening to the other panelists.
I actually want to pick up, can I pick up really quick on that? Because I didn't have a lot of time to talk about narrative, but part of the work that we did was trying to identify, so we're talking about narratives about people in poverty and about poverty in the US. And so related to what David just said, we identified a few sort of false, inaccurate narratives that actually on their surface might not seem that bad, but they're actually damaging to progress. And one of those is that as Americans, we often like to point to shooting stars. We like to point to the young person that grew up in a low-income neighborhood and now he plays in the NBA and he's making all this money. Or a young woman who grew up in a low-income situation and now she's a pop star or a Hollywood actress. She's making all this money. And we like to point to that and say, look at this rags to riches story. The American dream is alive. Look at her, look at him. But the problem with that narrative is it then causes people to question and say, well, Lashon can make it. Nisha, I don't understand what's wrong with you. Like, he made it, and he came out of that situation. And that ignores the structural issues when you only focus on the individual. And so that's part of the narrative change I think that has to happen, is connecting that individual change to the structure that either helped or inhibited that change from happening.
Yeah. There's so many threads to pick up on here, but the one that I would like to pick up on is we've had this sort of nothing about us without us sort of phrase in this work that is you have to have youth organizing at the center, or at least as work. And I think what we're talking about here is that youth organizing is more than just getting young people to have some input into what the collaborative is doing. We're talking about something much more profound in terms of transforming young people and getting sort of these skills and these experiences that they must have. It's kind of, it's not just a vehicle, it's a kind of an end in itself. I think. And I'm curious to know from you, Eric, what have you seen youth organizing efforts in an organization? I saw your research around how it can really, done well, transform an organization. What does it look like when the youth organizing is essentially marginalized and not really at the center of the work? And what advice would you give people in this room who might feel like their youth organizing, I don't know if this is true, but I'm just positing, might feel like their youth organizing is not as central as it should be, and they really do want to change the culture of their organization to really take it in. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and Lashon as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that organizing, again, we'll keep coming back to this theme that organizing is building power, right? And I always remember the Frederick Douglass quote that power concedes nothing without demand, right? We will, that the voices of young people are essential in this work is about them, and they do have the ability to organize to make to transform their institutions. So I would encourage those young people to figure out how to come together and build the kinds of organizations and figure out what their demands are and what the changes that they want to make are, and how do they, again, build a big enough base, right? I think one of the mistakes that I see a lot in organizing, again, is that we end up falling back on an advocacy model of having these few charismatic leaders, rather than saying, how do we engage our whole community, right? Who is the community that we are accountable to, and how do we engage as many of them as possible? Because if we really want all kinds of big changes, we need a lot of people with us. We need a large constituency. So my encouragement to folks is, the folks who are able to win those kinds of big changes that we see are really building a big base, engaging lots of leaders, and they're figuring out how to engage both in sort of issue organizing and direct action, but also thinking about how to deal with the political system as well. And all of those aspects are important.
Lashon, anything you would add to that?
I can kind of build on what he was saying. I think for opportunity youth specifically, I feel like issues and consistency are important, because I feel like our young people are sort of targeted and almost like used to put anytime they're asked to engage, there's usually to move a specific agenda, and it's not in a general sense of we just want to empower you, you know what I mean? It's always like we want to empower you to move this agenda, right? And that has implications a lot for why our young people are turned off, right? Because folks are only in their face when it's like an election coming up, again, when folks are trying to move fast. But like what we learned is, one, you have to be consistent. So folks are asking us, like after the 2016, asking us like, why y'all still asking people to vote? Like, we have to do this every day. It's in our everyday conversation. Again, when you're trying to create a culture or something, you got to be consistent, and you got to drive that message home, right? So that's one thing. And then we also had to really, like you said, figure out what the issues were. Like, even though we as a national, we have somewhat of an agenda, we're very clear, like we have somewhat of an agenda. Hopefully you agree with it. But we also want to talk to you about what issues do you care about in your community, right? So every community action team, the 2,000 members that we got, it's not a lot, but we take pride. We have sat in a room with their young people and had that conversation with them, like, what are the issues impacting your community? Okay, these are the issues. What are your solutions? Okay, make an action plan, right? So they have that autonomy to fully exert, because it's another thing to just build them with these skills and not give them an opportunity to flex, right? So again, we try to like get them talking about the issues in the community and immediately get them to start thinking and designing their own solutions before we pull the adults to the table. But again, I think that when you talk about power building with our young people, it has to be consistent, and they organize around issues.
Around their own issues, right. So I want to turn now to invite audience comments and questions, and we have mics, although we're starting with Shanice and Amanda, and are you mic'd? There we are, you have mics. Okay, Shanice Turner.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. So thank you so much for making this a conversation rather than like a speaking engagement, because this is an issue that is really important to me. So I would like to answer the first question. How did this dialogue resonate with me? It definitely resonated with me, especially with the healthcare in Atlanta. We're known as the highest in young people with having the sexual transmitted disease of AIDS and HIV. And being within that age range, I want to make sure, I mentioned this in our United Way Youth Advisory Council, that I would want young people to walk into a doctor's office or a clinic empowered and not afraid. To know that, with you, Eric, that the young people do find healthcare as one of the 4 important tasks to them. It made me feel happy to know that we are taking accountability and power into our health. With you, David, you made mention of affordable healthcare, and that for every 1 store that was closed, you had 3 more put up. And with that, that means more economic development. And with the Jimmy John's being $20 an hour, how many young people are you empowering? And how many young people are you giving hope to just by doing that? And I'm sure it's in their communities too, with accessible transportation. With you, Nisha, you mentioned that your board has, I want to say 80% of people of color?
Well, majority, so just over 50%.
Majority, okay. And that makes me extremely encouraged that it's just not the young boards that are having minorities, that it is also the boards that are over us and doing more leadership than we're doing, that are integrating diversity into them. With you, Lashon, I love your passion for OYU and that you make sure that these youth-led movements are truly youth-led. He made mention of the 100K. It was an amazing event in Atlanta, and it was the 7th one in Atlanta as well, 7th city. So what that means, we had over 5,000 participants, and you should have been there. The young people smiling for getting a blazer, a tie, someone talking to them, speaking to them as if they're a person. It was impactful. It made me feel powerful. It made me feel like the work that I'm doing here in this city, in Seattle and Atlanta, is actually doing something and that we're actually getting somewhere. The second question is, how does it connect the organizing youth-led change and what am I doing back home? So I have some notes here that this connects back to my work in Atlanta in a way that it makes people feel power. It makes people feel powerful. And the young people in my city, they feel power by holding a weapon to your face. I've been experiences on the other side of that. This connects to youth-led work, that movement, by doing it with United Way in our Youth Advisory Council and with the amazing event with the 100K. It was a power play, as you would say, that in our city it strengthens. It makes more emphasis on healthcare and self-care within ourselves. It isn't the highest priority with our young people, but we're going to continue making that more of an effort because with that, that also includes mental health, being more involved in criminal justice, and making sure that the people feel empowered. Understanding, I want the adults here to leave that youth movements work, youth-led movements work. They give people power by providing spectacular reports and results, as you see the many results that Lashon had mentioned with the pictures and the data that was also mentioned as well. There are statistics that when you empower a young person by being their mentor, taking care of them, you increases their standard, not only of importance, but you also make them want to do more for themselves because you're showing yourself as a standing foundation and a figure for them that they may not ever had. In Atlanta, the results that we do when we feel empowered is that there are many different youth-led movements, such as Black Lives Matter, Civil Rights, the Seattle Washington Walkout with Lake Washington, and in Atlanta, we have march parades and protests in Atlanta. So that are my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Shanice. So if anyone wants to do youth-led organizing around healthcare, talk to Shanice. All right.
Also, just talk to Shanice in general. She's lovely. So some of the things that resonated with me was talking about power and talking about autonomy in youth movements. And I am super fortunate to be the Youth Voice Project Coordinator in Boston. And we are autonomous. We design our own projects. We go into communities and we host our own town halls and ask young people ourselves what we want to do. And we have the ability to design what we want, what we think is effective, and what young people tell us is effective. So it was really affirming to hear that from all of you and to see research. I also went to Eric's session earlier because I wanted more research. And to see that there's research to back these things up, and it's not just me and it's not just the team saying that these things work. It's not just all the leaders here saying that these things work, that there's actual data behind it. And so to move into this conversation around power, I do want to talk to the adults in the room and channel our great youth leader, Jacob, who's not here this time, but she always challenges y'all as we close a plenary. And so I think I want to move into that space. So I liked the continuum of youth voice from deficit to voice to power. So I know adults sometimes can get a little antsy because we say we want a seat at the table, and then we say we want a bigger seat at the table, and then we say we want to be the table, and then we say we want more tables for more young people, and we want all the tables to be young people, and that's because it's our lives. Like, it's my friends, it was me, it is me. Like, Opportunity Youth is personal to us, and it'll never be personal in that same way for adults. It just won't. And so we are always going to keep pushing and asking for more because we know it can be done, and we need adult allyship and support in this area. We can't do it by ourselves, but we'll try, and we'll keep asking you for more, and if you don't give us the opportunities, we'll make them ourselves. So those are some things I wanted to leave y'all with. And then the very last thing I will say is that we talk about pathways, and we talk about system change, and we talk about how it's hard and how it's slow. It's harder to be an OY. I think that that's just a thought that sometimes escapes folks when you're so deep in the work, and it's not that we're not doing good work, but there needs to be an urgency and there needs to be a necessity, and when we're talking about youth-led change, you need to hold it as high as you hold pathways, as high as you hold the secondary credential. Youth-led change, youth development, and youth empowerment needs to be held at that same level of vitality. It needs to be there, or you're not doing OY work.
That was great. Thank you. Jacob, you're in the room. Okay, so we have a couple of minutes for comments or questions, and given how limited our time is, and I bet people are running off to the airport after this, so we are not going late, I'm going to ask you to be crisp with your comments or your questions, and mics are standing by.
It's like the old guy has a question.
Thank you. I'm way old, so I'm just going to sit. I'm not going to stand. Thanks. So a question for anybody on the panel, the resurrection of the Poor People's Campaign that's just begun right now, Reverend Barber, just how should we be thinking about it? There's already, this is kind of in the context of David's call to think big. Let's not go for $7.75 an hour. That's a thing. They're calling for major transformation. Just reactions to it. Maybe you want to better summarize it than I have, but just reactions from everybody on the panel about the Poor People's Campaign.
I forgot I got a mic right here. So we've actually talked about this with OIU. We're trying our best to figure out how to show up as we continue to strengthen our movement, how to best show up with our allies across different movements. And the Poor People Campaign, we agree with their values, we agree with their everything that they're right? And I think that's where the intergeneration cross mix, because we work to stop calling young people at risk, disconnected, and all that. We got Opportunity Youth that we're going to ask them to join a campaign called Poor People's Campaign. Like, the title alone, you know what I mean? It's kind of like we need to revisit. Again, empower folks and not feel like we're poor, you know? And it's just like, I don't know. So that just turned me off the rip. I couldn't even tell you really what they're just based off of the name. But my boss, you know, some of our leaders are in tune with it, but I think that when you're trying to be inclusive of everyone, you have to figure out, are you reinforcing what we're trying to do and take away these negative labels that we're putting on our people? So I'll just stop there.
Okay. Others? Yeah, Eric?
I was going to get to talk about the Poor People's Campaign as part of this conversation, because you know it's just started this week with 37 state capitals across the country. With and my mother was arrested in Harrisburg this week, you know, the history of it, I think, is quite, you know, is really important. You know, towards the end of his life, Martin Luther King started talking about that we've moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. That we can no longer be in the point where somebody has the right to pick a hamburger but can't afford to buy it. And that there were going to be some fundamental economic transformations that needed to happen in this country if we were going to develop poverty, if we were going to end poverty, and that he talked about uniting the poor across race as a new and unsettling force. And that vision of folks across race coming together to say that we are a nation that could end poverty, but that it will require that kind of a multiracial alliance to do it, and it will require some really bold and moral action, right? It's, you know, part of what I like about the Poor People's Campaign and Reverend Barber's leadership is that it's really grounded in this moral principle about eliminating poverty. And I think it's that kind of bold action that's going to be required if we're really going to take this on. And so I think it's a really exciting development, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with much of what Eric just said, and, you know, to Lashon's point, I think, yeah, the name, it is an old school name. It's a resurrection of an old campaign. So on April 4th, the anniversary of Dr. King's assassination, I had the privilege of being invited to be on 1A with Joshua Johnson and Reverend Barber and somebody from Fight for 15, sort of talking about this, and they were getting ready to launch the campaign. And so I think if you can get past the title, what's underneath there, I think some of the principles and the arguments I do feel very aligned with. And if you look at the original Poor People's Campaign, one of the things that I think that was so powerful is even back then, when we were a less diverse nation than we are now, it was a multiracial, multi-ethnic movement. And so I think that's sort of, I agree with what, I mean, I think Eric made that point already, agree with that in principle. And the other thing that I think is powerful and oftentimes isn't in the spotlight in national conversations. I mean, I've heard here about all of your local organizing, but the fact that they're in state capitals is how much state policy matters for a lot of the issues we all care about. And it's always been important, and it always probably, we have a federal system for better or worse, probably always will be important, but it's probably the place in the next 3 years, if you want to sort of think short term, where there actually might be some opportunity for traction. And so I really like that focus on the state capitals.
Great.
I just reiterate that I agree with the values and principles. I just don't like it.
Yeah, I hear you.
So this is a great topic. Thank you for that question. And we could have gone on, but we can't. We have to close out this session. So a round of applause for these amazing organizers. And I think we invite Steve up to the stage to close us out. Is that right? Why don't we just sit here and listen to him, shall we?
Yeah, I'm going to be super brief. I heard a bunch of you say, "Get the bar under your front." So we're going to close it out real quick here. First, let's thank that awesome panel conversation. Well, I don't know what we call it. The TED where's Israel? Was that Grey Poupon, that Avion, that TED Talk A, or something like that? To quote Kendrick, we started with Kendrick, we'll finish with Kendrick. Before we go out, just a few things. One is, if you're going on one of the cool REI trips, now that the sun is back out, meet in the lobby. So thank you, REI. Actually, if you guys have a chance to put all the sponsors up, let's make sure we have many photographic moments for our sponsors, thanking our sponsors for this amazing gathering. And REI is one of the special ones because part of what they sponsored were these trips. So if you're going, look for the REI leaders in the lobby. Thank you. I guess I'll just say on behalf of Melody and Monique, who both, couldn't be here, we deeply appreciate the sponsors who helped make this happen. I want to thank the Aspen staff, everybody who works for the Forum for Community Solutions team. If you're here, just stand up for a second, please, so we can acknowledge your leadership. And then really want to thank all of you for really being in this conversation, staying in this network, voting with your feet, doing the hard work on the ground, acknowledging it's harder to be an OY than it is to be a person who's thinking about that and thinking about pathways and all the other stuff we talk about. So I really want to acknowledge the leadership in this room and the communities and the young people and the network that you've built. It feels like there's a lot of wind in our sails right now and a lot of momentum for progress. And so we stand in solidarity with all of you, and this work will certainly continue. And you heard at the beginning a little bit of the framing of some of the things we want to do together going forward. When we reconvene October 8th through 10th in Aspen, we'll have a lot more meat on the bones for some of the next steps that we can take together in this movement. So the work continues. We are officially adjourned. Many of us are going to go into some now sub-meetings. Look at your agenda for those. But thank you for being here, and see you next in Aspen. Thanks, everybody.